My name is David Myers. I teach history here at UCLA, and I hold the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History. And I want to take this opportunity at the outset to thank our friends Jim and Lori Keir for all they've done to promote Jewish studies and the Kahn name here at UCLA. I'm also really delighted to welcome Professor Naomi Seidman of the University of Toronto to give the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn lecture in German Jewish Studies, which is sponsored by the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies and its extraordinary staff, whom I thank, as we all do. Naomi is one of the most creative scholars working today in the field of Jewish studies. She is the Chancellor Jackman Professor of the Arts in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto. Her books include Faithful Renderings, Jewish-Christian Difference and the Poetics of Difference, The Marriage Plot, or How Jews Fell in Love and with Literature. Penultimate book was her outstanding work of historical scholarship on the Beis Yaakov school system and its founder, Sarah Schneer. For her multiple efforts in the field of Jewish studies and intersecting domains, she's been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2016, a National Jewish Book Award in 2019, and her podcast, The Heretic in the House, was awarded a Signal Award in 2023. So there are a couple of through lines in Naomi's work that I'd like to highlight. First, her careful, innovative, and interdisciplinary reading of literature, and especially of Yiddish and Hebrew literature, and the complex and interesting connections between them. And second, the project of translation, of transposing words from one language to another, and thereby introducing, interpolating, and imposing new cultural meanings. In her newest book, Naomi brings her longstanding project and interest in translation to the well-covered and yet tricky terrain of Sigmund Freud. Her book poses a number of interrelated questions, not only the usual question of how well Freud might have known Hebrew and Yiddish, but where does one find traces of those languages in his writings? Second, the book asks about the translation of Freud's works into Hebrew and Yiddish as a lens into the broader cultural phenomenon of the reception of psychoanalysis for readers of those languages. And third, she explores the conversation, as it were, between Freud and the polymathic scholar and YIVO founder Max Weinreich, who translated Freud into Yiddish. Each of these is a world unto its own, but Naomi has brought them together with great skill and ingenuity in translating Freud, about which she's going to talk. We had a slight misunderstanding about what we were going to do today, but it seems to make sense to have Naomi talk about the book and a number of the key questions that arise in it for a relatively brief amount of time, 20 or 30 minutes, and then we will engage in conversation, and then we'll open up for discussion with all of you. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to welcome to this podium Naomi Seidman.
Hi. Thank you so much. So I thought I was going to do this academic talk. So then maybe I should be there so I could advance the slides. Okay. So sorry, we're obviously trying to figure it out. First of all, thank you so much, David, for that beautiful introduction and for inviting me to UCLA, and thank you to the grad students I've just been hanging out with, and postdocs also, and visiting students. And thank you also to Chelsea Shiram for helping make this happen. So I'm just going to start by talking about the book in general. So this is a very small portion of these books I've been collecting for at least 10 years. And I was collecting them for a very long time without really reading them or even exactly thinking about why I was collecting them. They were, my research corpus, but I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with them because I knew I didn't want to write another Jewish Freud book. which was another book which demonstrates that everything Freud said is, no matter what he says it's about, it's really actually about Jewish stuff. So, in other words, the penis envy, according to Sandra Gilman, is really about Jewish male insecurity. Right, Woody Allen, I think, had that joke about how he too has penis envy. So the basic mode of reading Freud is to turn Freudian ideas in some ways against himself. And I didn't want to do that. And it occurred to me at some point in collecting these books, and I could describe what some of them are. This is the first book of Freud to be translated to Yiddish, and I love this one because it has a borrower's card. It was due on February 19th, 1948, and it was returned. What?
To where?
To Socialist Library in Toronto. This is Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, which is a 1935 book by Max Weinreich, Freud's quote-unquote authorized Yiddish translator, which uses psychoanalytic method to describe what Jewishness is and how it's transmitted. Totem and Taboo is actually probably the best known. This Hebrew Totem and Taboo has an introduction by Freud. The introduction by the writer to the Hebrew edition, and the reason why this is best known is that this is the only one of Freud's introductions to translations that was canonized by being put into the standard edition in English. So it struck me that I loved these books and was collecting them without knowing what my research project was, but that I wasn't the only one that loved these books. Freud, when he left Vienna in 1938, had basically sold a large portion of his library, and he gave a lot of the rest of the library away to friends. And he took with him to London a copy of this book, and which I found in a used bookstore in Jerusalem, the Book Gallery, if anyone's keeping track. And this was my first acquisition in this area. I was like, oh, wow. Freud in Hebrew while he was still alive, and I immediately bought it. It was 35 shekels. There was no way I was going to buy it. And Freud took it with him to London, and this is evidence, among other pieces of evidence to Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, that Freud really did know Hebrew, and I did not consider this any kind of evidence. I wasn't even reading the book, and I also wanted the book. So, in other words, what I was looking at is what there was about the Hebrew language and the Yiddish language, his own thought in the garb of these letters, which I believe, this is the radical aspect of my book, is that I take Freud at his word. I think the first Jewish studies scholar to do this. I thought, let's just try it. And believing that Freud did not know how to read his own words in Hebrew translation, and that he would nevertheless want to take this book with him to London, seemed meaningful to me, and something that I actually in some way had in common with Freud, even though I could read the books, just didn't bother for a very long time. And it also seems to me to be significant that Freud wrote his most direct, I think, acknowledgement of his Jewishness in this introduction, which I should have brought to English, but he says, as you know, he always thought he had to tell his Jewish readers that, because he was afraid they'd be shocked, that he didn't believe in God or the Jewish religion, and he said he had no nationalist feeling, and yet he feels something very, very deep when he holds the papers, I guess the proofs of the book in his hand, and he said, and this Jewishness that I feel right now is the deepest part of me, and one day science will be able to explain what that is. This sounds like science fiction, unless you're Max Weinreich, here's the book in which Max Weinreich tried to explain what that was. And Freud, I should just say, in Totem and Taboo, Freud says very explicitly, this is not a book about Jews or the Bible. The Hebrew translator who appended all kinds of crazy translator notes to this that go on and on and on, beg to differ. Freud said totemism was not a Jewish thing. They're like, look at all the Jewish boys named Ari and Dove, animal names. We think this totemism is Jewish. So the question, I'll just say the question of how Jewish psychoanalysis is. It's clear that Yehuda de Vera-Devosis thought he knew. It's still an open question, and it's not one that I'm at all interested in diving into. This is the big field of the rest of the people doing Freud. What I'm interested in instead is why is it that when he's reading this translation, when Freud is reading this Hebrew translation, that that's the moment that he feels that he should be talking about his Jewishness. He had no doubt that the Hebrew translation of Totem and Taboo, despite the fact that it wasn't a Jewish book, as evidenced by the fact that the Hebrew title is Totem V'Taboo. There's no other possible translation in Hebrew. In other words, this is a foreign work produced in Hebrew that the translator clearly feels is very Jewish. But Freud himself, whether Totem and Taboo is Jewish or not, the translation certainly is. And he considers it of great Jewish significance that he's translated into Hebrew. So when I mean certainly is, I don't mean I think so, I mean Freud thought so. So what happens if you displace the question of just how Jewish psychoanalysis, is it a Jewish science, that old question, and instead look at the thing that's not a question, which is the relationship between Freud and his translators, his feelings about these translations, the translators' feelings about Freud's work, and the physical objects that, despite the fact that Freud couldn't read them, as I believe he couldn't, and despite the fact that I didn't even open it up for at least 5 years after buying it, that these are meaningful objects that allow me, in some sense, to touch Freud. So that's sort of the book as a whole. Maybe I'll just say a couple of other things about some of these others. This is a Freud edition of a Yiddish literary journal. It came out of Argentina. I'm looking at the year. I should have looked this up before. Of course, it has the Hebrew year. I don't even mean the year. It has the month. So I think it's from the 50s at some point. And this is reminding me to say that there's one, obviously, this is a huge field, which is the field of the international reception of psychoanalysis, in which the Hebrew and Yiddish translations are a mere nothing back, where there is just very few of these translations, and it's who cares, besides me and Freud. But nevertheless, I think I discovered something important about the history of psychoanalysis in general by looking at it in this very marginal way, which is that if you read books about the famous Freud craze in Argentina, you will read that in Argentina, everybody got interested in Freud in the early 1930s. If you read the Yiddish press, it's clear that Yiddish-speaking Buenos Aires participated along with the rest of the Yiddish-speaking world, especially the secular Yiddishist world, in a Freud craze. And this Freud craze, which is everywhere in the Yiddish press from Buenos Aires, has not been noticed by scholars who believe that they're going to find the origins of this fascination with Freud in Spanish as they continue to do it. So I'm just going to, if this seems like the right thing to do, I'm going to now move to one of the chapters of my book, which is the chapter called The Yiddish Unconscious. Now, one of the things that I am looking at is this ideology that drives the Yiddish and Hebrew translations of Freud, which is the idea that the deepest part of the secular acculturated Jew is basically a Yid or a Yid, right? That old joke. Which, by the way, goes back to the 1920s and already came up in conversation between Ernest Jones and Alan Strachey, who were the Freud's main English translators. So what I want to talk about is that ideology of the of what it means to be translating Freud into what is, in some fantastic imaginary way, his native language, his heritage tongue, his true language, the language of the unconscious. So, is that okay? Can I show you, just launch into this? How does this work? Yay! The Israeli literary critic Dan Miron relates that in the last conversation he had with Max Weinreich before his 1969 death, Weinreich touched yet again on the tender subject of the New York exile of Yivo, the Vilna-based Institute for the Study of Eastern European Jews that he had long directed. Weinreich suggested that despite it all, Yivo's Yiddish holdings might retain some value even in their new home. I don't know about you Israelis, he said to Miron, but by now I know my American Jews, young ones included. If American Jews still dream as a group, Yiddish is the language they speak in their dreams. It is still the idiom of their collective unconscious. For their personality to become whole, at least some of them will have to go back to Yiddish someday, and there we shall be, waiting for them down in the Yiddish cellar with a strong torchlight in our hand. Somebody will have to spell out for them the contents of their dreams, to elucidate the vision they saw with bleary eyes. And we, because we made Yiddish Wissenschaft the thing we live and die for, will be able to throw light and heal. Like Freud, whose work he translated, maybe I'll go back to this. Like Freud, whose work he translated into Yiddish, Weinreich saw himself here as a dream interpreter with access to a language and its scholarship that could throw light and heal. Yiddish, for Weinreich, was the language of the collective dream of American Jews, even if they themselves could hardly understand it. To follow Weinreich's train of thought, we might suppose that Freud, as an acculturated German-speaking Jew of Eastern European heritage, also dreamed in Yiddish, even if he interpreted his dreams and those of others in German. If psychoanalysis, with its Eastern European past, also had a cellar where dreams unfold in a half-understood Yiddish, the Yiddish translation of Freud's work might help decode those dreams. Beyond studying Eastern European Jewish history and culture, Yivo promised to clarify the muffled reverberations of this culture in its American exile. So too might Yiddish translate these submerged voices within psychoanalysis in its Viennese homeland and global diaspora. It wasn't only interpretation that was at stake in the post-Holocaust Yivo. Weinreich considered American Jews to be suffering for all their material comfort from an inner psychic fragmentation created by shame and cultural amnesia. Yiddish, the language of their past, could heal the shame by bringing suppressed traumas to consciousness. Yivo could cure what ailed American Jews also by virtue of the fact that it was a scientific institute devoted to championing Yiddish and itself operated, like psychoanalysis, under the sublime authority of science. If Yiddish was shameful because of its lowly feminine origins, a kitchen language, a Yiddish scientific institute could grant Yiddish academic masculine status as a language that healed Jewish sexual shame through its scientific lens. Although Weinreich doesn't say so, the return of Eastern European Jewish language and culture, scientifically understood, to the scene of psychoanalysis might have similar hermeneutic powers and therapeutic effects. Let's see where that is. Among the holdings of Yivo, buried within Weinreich's voluminous personal archive, is a school notebook with the title Freud Laboratoria. The notebook dates from the period in the mid-1930s when Weinreich was working in Vilna on the first few volumes of his translation of Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. The 28 lectures Freud delivered to a lay audience at the University of Vienna between 1915 and 1917. Weinreich's notebook lists difficult or ambiguous German terms in the order in which they appeared in the lectures, providing equivalents in Yiddish, Hebrew, or occasionally English or Polish, and a draft of a German-Yiddish glossary of basic psychoanalytic terms. Weinreich's Einführung Psychoanalysis was the last Yiddish rendering of Freud's work, and the only one, as the title page proclaimed, authorized by Freud. The Einführung was as close as Yiddish got to its own standard edition. This status derived from Weinreich's reputation as a scholar of both Yiddish and Freudian thought, from his relationship with Freud, and from the institutional, how do you say that word, imprimatur? You know how to pronounce all these words. Imprimatur, like in German, of Yivo, the publisher. I actually looked it up and then forgot to go back.
I say imprimatur.
What?
I say imprimatur.
Imprimatur. These circumstances make Weinreich's book a multilingual Jewish counterpart to Ernest Jones' 1924 Glossary of Psychoanalytic Terms, which was used to produce the standardized professional jargon that positioned psychoanalysis as a legitimate part of the Anglo-American medical sciences. Unlike Strachey, Weinreich had no need to lend psychoanalysis a scientific patina in a context in which psychoanalysis lacked an institutional presence or clinical aspirations. If anything, it was Yiddish that gained scientific status by association with psychoanalysis. It's striking, then, that he no doubt humorously titled his notebook Freud Laboratory. Bettelheim argues that the Greek mythical and literary tradition beloved to Freud was obscured by the medical Latinate terms of Strachey's English in an attempt to position psychoanalysis as an exact science. This whole question of whether Wissenschaft is science, I'm going to leave to the side right now. But this attempt to make psychoanalysis more scientific was also intended, no doubt, to refute the charge that psychoanalysis was a Jewish science, which is to say, no science at all. In the 1913 exchange in which Freud shared with Ferenczi his worry that psychoanalysis would be perceived as a Jewish science, applying only to Jews or tainted by Jewish perspectives, Freud denied the coherence of such a category, or for that matter, of Aryan science. Science must be free of any taint of racial affiliation if it is to count as such. By contrast, YIVO, the Jiddische Wissenschaftliche Organisation, signaled in its name the scholarly, if not scientific, aspirations of the organization, its commitments to raising the status of Yiddish, and its Jewish approach to scholarship. And what you see up there is the letterhead into our period with Sigmund Freud prominently displayed on the board of governors, or what was it called? The scholarly board, I think it was called. Jonathan Boyarin has drawn attention to the distinction between Wissenschaft des Judentum, as the study of Judaism, written in a non-Jewish language, and taking Judentum as the passive object of study, and Jiddische Wissenschaft, meaning, in which the adjective Yiddish, meaning Jewish and Yiddish, and written in a Jewish alphabet, modifies Wissenschaft. Unlike Wissenschaft des Judentum, which describes Jewishness, Jiddische Wissenschaft is both the science of the Jews and a Jewish kind of Wissenschaft, and as such, it provincializes the allegedly universal, culturally neutral category of science. At YIVO, not only the objects of study, but also the language and methods, the hopes and dreams of this research were explicitly and openly Jewish. To this day, the relationship between the Jewish influences on Freud and the universalist and scientific claims of psychoanalysis remain unsettled. For YIVO, the Jewish character of its scientific research was announced at the front door. The translation of Freud into Yiddish constitutes a unique set of circumstances within the global dispersion of psychoanalysis. By most standards, the reception and translation of Freud in Yiddish is a curiosity, a minor, short-lived episode in psychoanalytic history. Researchers writing psychoanalytically oriented work in Yiddish played no role in national or international psychoanalytic organizations, to my knowledge, until the Argentinian Moise Kijak, or Moshe, began publishing his psychoanalytic readings of Yiddish literature in the 1960s, and he's still alive and still publishing. The subfield included not a single trained psychoanalyst. From the geographical perspective, Yiddish was a backwater in the reception history of psychoanalysis, which is more usually mapped through the move from Austria to other regions in Central and Western Europe, and from Europe to the United States, the major center after Freud's death. In the narrower realm of translation, the Yiddish renderings of Freud form a meager addition to a crowded shelf. In 1923, Freud boasted of translations into Russian, English, French, Spanish, Italian, Polish, Norwegian, Japanese, quote-unquote Chinese, and other languages. Yiddish, however, had yet to appear on any such list, with the first translation appearing only in 1928. Despite this belatedness and marginality, Yiddish played a unique role in the global history of psychoanalysis as a feature of Freud's linguistic and cultural heritage. Freud spoke little about the place of Yiddish in his family history, but he provides us with ample tools to conceptualize the language as a repressed fragment of a buried past. It's not only Weinreich who associated Yiddish with the unconscious of acculturating Jews. The French psychoanalyst Max Kahn begins his book on Yiddish and psychoanalysis with the more personal assertion that my unconscious speaks Yiddish. That is for sure. It's true that Yiddish-speaking Eastern Europe was a backwater in the global dispersion of psychoanalysis, the strongest of most fateful currents of which flowed in the westerly direction. But it's also true that this region, apparently so distant from the nerve centers of psychoanalysis, was also the ancestral home of so many of the founding members of Freud's first students, which included ambitious young men and women who joined the wider stream of emigration from the eastern provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to Freud's Vienna. And the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society had at least 19 members who had grown up in Polish lands, including Helene Deutsch, the founder of the society. Paul Rosen, Deutsch's biographer, suggests that Freud drew so many disciples from Polish lands because for centuries of partition, Poland persisted as an idea rather than as a recognized political entity, an idea that had powerful effects on the continent in the same way that the unconscious invisibly guided human affairs. If Freud and these early psychoanalysts emerged from, or in some sense wherever they went still inhabited, an unrecognized Poland, they also emerged from an even less recognized or authorized Yiddish land that was itself repressed and fragmented within the repressed, fragmented Poland. Even the return of the Polish repressed, for instance, with the founding of the Independent Republic of Poland in 1918, could not alter the status and character of Yiddish land, which was hardly confined to these borders. The Yiddish engagement with Freud unfolded against the background of Yiddishism, which sought to democratize the relationship between German and Yiddish, and just as importantly, distinguish between them. This was an ideological revolution, but also an effective and psychological one, seeking to heal Jewish shame by means of Jewish pride, replacing the kitchen language with the language at home in the laboratory, countering the failed projects of emancipation and integration with Jewish nationalism, using Yiddish, in other words, as therapy and cure for Jewish modernity. Yiddish psychoanalysis thus involved both understanding the language of the Ashkenazic unconscious and providing a laboratory for experimenting with the possibility and value of Yiddische Wissenschaft, of raising the Yiddish unconscious to the rationalist heights of science. The revolution was headquartered in Vilna, in the newly built building of the YIVO, but the revolutionary fervor caught up Freud and other Central Europeans. And in the April 1930 letter to YIVO, published in Weinreich's Rheinfehr, in place of an introduction to the Yiddish publication, Freud writes of his great pleasure in hearing that the first volume of the Vorlesungen was about to appear in Yiddish translation. And this is, unlike the introduction to Totem and Taboo, this one we only have in Yiddish. The German original has not appeared in any of the archives that I was able to comb through. And this is what it says in the introduction. It was with great respect, and for those of you who can read, here it is. It was with great respect, Groß derech Eretz, that I took in my hands the first pages that you sent me. It's a shame that more I could not do. When I was a student, they took no trouble to instill the national tradition, so I did not learn to read either Hebrew or Yiddish, which saddens me today. Nevertheless, I am a good Jew, although not, as you probably know, a believer. Freud here, neither was Weinreich or any of the other people reading this, most probably. Freud here clearly distinguishes his present stance from his earlier attitude toward Jewish languages that conditioned his own education and led to his failure to learn to read or to retain what he learned of not only Hebrew but also Yiddish, rendered here as a language fully equivalent to Hebrew. What was shameful at this point in Freud's life was not Yiddish, but his own ignorance of the language. And I talked a little bit about the Hebrew preface that he wrote, so I'll skip that here to make better time so I could start my conversation with David. And this is also a little summary of what I was saying before. Whatever one makes of the question that Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi put to Freud, Freud's ghost, of whether psychoanalysis was in some way a Jewish science, there's no doubt that for Freud, the translations of his work into Jewish languages, the emotions he felt in seeing the Hebrew letters, had profound Jewish meaning that he hoped would be clarified in the course of psychoanalytic research. These affects, intersubjective, interlinguistic, and transgenerational, are the subject of my book as a whole. But in what remains of my talk, I'd like to focus on how they shaped the translations themselves for translators like Weinreich, who understood their work through the ideology that saw Yiddish as the Jewish unconscious of acculturated Jews, lying hidden beneath the facade of non-Jewish tongues. If this were so, translation into Yiddish might reveal itself not in the usual way as a movement away from the original German, but rather as the recovery of something that had been lost in Freud's German, raising Jewish ghosts buried in Freud's work. And yet, if Yiddish was the language of the Jewish unconscious, it might be significant that Yiddish translators had a really hard time figuring out how to say that in Yiddish. First, providing a kind of, before Weinreich, providing a kind of Germanic gloss, Yiddishizing gloss on Freud's Unbewusst, Unbewusstsein, and then for Freud's two first Yiddish translators and for Weinreich's early work, and then with Weinreich working really hard to plumb the depths of the Yiddish lexicon for the archaism Wissig or Unwissig and Wissigkeit, etc. But Weinreich's choice did not stick, and even his son Oriel, in his great dictionary, reverted to the German calque Unbewusst. Yiddish may have been the language of the Jewish unconscious, but translators still had to struggle to express that thought. So, do the Yiddish translations of Freud's work in fact succeed in supplying a Jewish vision of what lies latent or repressed in the German? Freud didn't bring up that famous story of his father's fur cap being knocked off in the introductory lectures, so we don't know whether Weinreich would have recognized that fur cap as the Streimel, identified by Jewish studies scholars much later. Freud does, however, relate a dream in the introductory lectures that refers to Samstag, though it's as clear as day, but which day, that Freud means Shabbos. Here is the dream in its entirety. Oh, that was my little, sorry that this is all. This is the dream. And there you can see it's basically two images that appear side by side. This dream consists of only two pictures. His uncle was smoking a cigarette, although I'll use the standard edition translation, although it was Saturday. A woman was caressing and fondling him as though he were her child. In the interpretation of the dream that follows, Freud practices two kinds of translation. First, he has to explain to his audience, and I'll remind you that these are lectures, that the dreamer's uncle was a pious Jew, and pious Jews are not supposed to smoke on Saturday. Secondly, he translates this religious sin into secular or universal transgression, reading smoking on Shabbos as incest linked with the Sabbath through the sexual, sinful cigarette. But who's to say, if you put these two dream images side by side, whether to read them from up to down or left to right, as Freud does, or rather the other way around, as Weinreich does? I hardly need to add that Weinreich translates Samstag as Shabbos. Here, no struggle was necessary. As beginning Yiddish teachers love to point out, it's the only possible translation. Yiddish has no word that means Saturday. Yiddish doesn't need that first level of psychoanalytic translation, where Freud explains to his German-speaking audience why it's relevant that the cigarette was smoked on Saturday. Yiddish already knows that, and knows perfectly well what that means. The Yiddish term is not so much missing in the German as has gotten lost. But where and when? In Freud's German speech, where it hardly finds a toehold? In the psyche of the dreamer? In his recounting of the dream to Freud? Or Freud's recounting it to his Viennese audience? Freud's lecture takes the Jewish sin as a misleading metaphor or facade for that most unspeakable and universal transgression, incest. But what's unspeakable here, incest or Judaism? In translating from the universal to the particular, from German to Yiddish, Weinreich raises the possibility that religious sins and sinners serve as both the facade of the psyche and its deepest level, that the loss of Jewish practice and the loss of Jewish sins might constitute both a top and a bottom line of interpretation, a cover, a substitute, or the root of sexual transgressions. Because Freud's German is already a translation of Shabbos to Samstag, translating Samstag into Shabbos both replays and undoes that move, from Yiddish to German, from one generation to the next, from tradition to modernity, and from east to west, the cultural context for the emergence of psychoanalysis. Yiddish cannot fully tell that story because that story depends on the swerve into German, for Freud or for the dreamer. Otherwise, how to explain how a day might go missing or its meaning get lost? And because Weinreich is translating in the only way he can, it might be fair to say that not Weinreich, but Yiddish itself raises to consciousness what had been hidden in the cellars of Freud's dreamers and hidden in a different way on the lecture stage. Weinreich abandoned the Freud translation when the Second World War broke out, turning his attention away from psychology and sociology toward linguistics and the task of rebuilding Evo on American soil. But the concepts of the conscious and the unconscious played a role in these spheres too, as might be inferred by Weinreich's suggestion that Evo was in some sense the cellar that was the unconscious, the collective unconscious of American Jews. These concepts play, I think, unanticipated and surprising role in Weinreich's great post-war project, The History of the Yiddish Language. Among the most influential contributions of Weinreich's magnum opus is his argument that what distinguishes Yiddish from other languages is not its character as a fusion language, a Schmelzsprach. Yiddishists were long united in demonstrating that the fusion of different components is a feature of most, if not all, languages, however fervently nationalists might imagine their own languages as pure. What distinguishes Yiddish is rather that for contingent historical reasons, its speakers had a heightened awareness of this characteristic, to a degree rare among speakers of other similarly fusion languages. Even uneducated Yiddish speakers possess to some degree what Weinreich called component consciousness, Wissigkeit, whether or not they were entirely aware of what it is they knew. Komponentenwissigkeit. Every Jew in Eastern Europe is a sophisticated comparatist. He prays in Lashon Kodesh, occasionally looks into a Lashon Kodesh book. He lives among Slavs, he encounters German in business, at work, at the spa. Until recently, you could still find simple people of the older generation who really did not know German, But in a given situation, they can easily, and without thinking, turn drei Chadoshim into drei Manaten, and instead of saying matana, the Yiddish term for a gift, they would say Geschenk. That's how you say it in German. If Yiddish was the unconscious of assimilated Jews, it was also, according to Weinreich, the language of traditional Jewish hyper-consciousness. Yiddish was the language of Komponentenwissigkeit, the technical term Freud coined. Weinreich, it's so weird to be making Freudian slips and to talk like this. Weinreich coined to describe what made Yiddish so distinctive. And this term was coined not in the course of his linguistic analysis, but rather in his translation of Freud. Wissigkeit and Unwissigkeit were the distinctive neologisms that Weinreich used in his never completed Yiddish translation of Freud, and wrested from the ashes of that project to describe Yiddish itself, making Freud serve Yiddish rather than using Yiddish in the service of Freud. As Weinreich pointed out, what was unconscious for the speakers of many national languages, the multiple components of the text of the tongues they called their own, was an intrinsic and concrete aspect of Yiddish consciousness. Yiddish speakers thus had access to what was for speakers of other languages deep history. Yiddish knew that no language was pure, that all people were wanderers and foreigners. Only the most educated or poetic of English speakers is aware of and feels the difference of the Romance and Anglo-Saxon elements of the language, although this history shapes the language even in being lost or buried. But Yiddish tells truths most directly about what German has suppressed. Perhaps this explains why it was so long treated with hostility by speakers of German above all. Weinreich's awareness of component consciousness may well have derived from his own immersion in the complicated borderlines that connected and separated Freud's German and his own Yiddish, though he was a native German speaker too. If all Jews were comparatists, that was certainly true of those who undertook translation from German into Yiddish. It was at this borderland that the question of what Yiddish could say that German could not, what Yiddish knew that German didn't, called out to the translator at every turn. Not only the sophisticated translator, a dedicated investigator of Eastern European Jewish culture, every Yiddish speaker could shine that strong torchlight and what others were able to see only with bleary eyes. Thank you. Did I take all our time?
Nope.
Oh, good, thank you.
Nope, not at all. Okay, so I think just time-wise, we'll maybe be in conversation for, 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll open up so you all have an opportunity to participate. I want to begin with something you talked about at the beginning, because it relates to things I've been interested in for a long time, and I want to hear your take on it. And that is the science question, the science envy that seems to be so pronounced in modern Jewish cultures. You talk about it at some length. That quest for the level of the niveau of science, so persistent in so many different domains.
Right.
And that interesting qualification, Wissenschaft des Judentums, Jüdische Wissenschaft, that's something that Buber discussed in I think in 1903.
Really?
Yeah,
oh my God, I've been citing Jonathan Boyarin.
Yeah.
He must have cited Buber. No, I don't think he did.
I don't know, but it's precisely that move that Buber sought to make. And there's an earlier referent that just came to my mind, which is Gretz's response to, I think, Sunz, when Sunz says, "You're going to write another history of the Jews?" And he said, this time, a Jewish history, a Yiddish Geschichte. So that trope, it has earlier iteration, or earlier echo presences, but it, in some sense, that qualified nature of a Jewish Wissenschaft is interesting. But that quest for science, like, what did that look like in your inquiry here?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, that Freud was so nervous about this question, and that outside of Jewish circles, Jewish scientists, you want to call them that, or Jewish scholars, did not have that problem of understanding that something could be scientific and Jewish at the same time. What have I come across? For some reason, I'm thinking about that conversation that I talk about, which is at the very end of Freud's life when he's visited by those three Yivo Steinberg, who we were just talking about, Yaakov Steinberg, the fascinating Orthodox, Yiddishist, anarchist, and Joseph Maitlis, these kind of Yiddishists and Freud. They came to visit Freud, and according to at least two of their accounts, Freud said to them, the way he said to every particularly Jewish-looking person who walked in the door, "Do you hate me because I wrote Moses' Monotheism?" Which is so something, tells you something about these games that are played between more acculturated and less acculturated Jews, that these like young Yiddishists would have some kind of Jewish authority that could allow Freud to feel okay about publishing Moses and Monotheism. And I think it was Steinberg who said to him, using halachic language, I don't know if I could repeat it, he said, that you may not abandon the truth because of the pressures of the day. I mean, I'm not, does that sound like a halachic? Anyway, when he said because of the pressures of Meitzorach HaSha'ah or whatever, he used a kind of rabbinic principle to say you are a scientist. And somehow, so I think that tells you something of the complications of that particular intersection between science and Jewishness, right? Like science had to be defended in these Jewish ways for Freud to feel like it was okay that he had written a book that he believed to be the scientific truth. If I could just say one more anecdote, which is, to me, I didn't even analyze it, because how do you analyze something like that? It was just such a powerful piece of history, because there was something called the scientific circle in the Vilna ghetto, and the notes of one of the lectures at this scientific circle in the Vilna ghetto they were rescued by that brigade that was supposed to save the papers for Rosenberg, the paper brigade, right? And they made it to Yivo, and in the Yivo you could see the lecture notes, beautiful, clear, colorful lecture notes. Like that's how you should do it, not like I just did it, right? Just clear notes on Jewish race science. And are Jews a race? And what does the Bible teach us? And it comes to the conclusion that Jews are a mixed race, and that all races are mixed race. And there's no mention of the ghetto walls, and the race science, and the Aryanism. And there's just, this is a kind of heroism of scholarship. I was talking about this with some of the graduate students. The field of scholarship, the activity, the profession, the occupation, the calling of scholarship has been so degraded and commercialized. And to have us, like to be in the ghetto and to go hear a talk about racial science and to hear it in Yiddish and to preserve the notes and to work so hard, that was all I wanted. I didn't want to figure out what science meant. These are my scientists. And to me, there's no Jewish science. Don't look at it in the German sphere. Look at it in Yivo. Those people were real scientists. They considered themselves real scientists. They wouldn't even use the word Jewish. They were better scientists. Okay, maybe that's just me, chauvinism. Is that even the beginning of an answer? You probably have a better answer.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. But we're not going to test it now. No, just the irony giving lectures on Jewish racial science in the middle again.
To the Vilna Scientific Society.
The Vilna Scientific Society, wow.
Yes.
That's absolutely astounding.
Tell me there's no such thing as a Jewish science.
Yeah.
Science is, it's affect. You're right to ask about it as a kind of like, science, is it a laboratory? Is it not a laboratory? Is it correct? Is it right? There's something about it that needs to be understood as a kind of pride, an activity with legitimacy.
It's aspirational, right? It's aspirational. That is the level to which one must arrive.
Yes.
And when one thinks of the origins of Wissenschaft des Judentums, it is such an essential companion of the aspiration for political emancipation. I mean, it's completely...
Right, it's right there on the surface.
Entangled with that.
And it's entangled with different things at the Evo period, for sure.
And then it becomes something else. I mean, then it makes its transition to Hebrew, though there's an intervening moment. This is now sort of getting into the weeds. Before it becomes Mada or Madei HaYadut.
It's Torah.
It's Chochmat Yisrael.
Oh, Chochmat Yisrael.
Right.
How about this? How about Torah Freud?
Torah Freud. Oh, man.
They use the word...
What is that?
This is one of the earliest explications of Freud in Hebrew, and it's called The Torah of Freud by M. Brachyahu.
Yeah, Torah can mean the system, the doctrine, but also the Torah, the teaching, all of those things.
Right.
So I gather you would say you're not really a scientist, but you're an excavator and an archaeologist in this project. And I'm curious, I'm really interested to know...
I'm a collector.
And collector, you discuss in the beginning of the book Benjamin's essay on collecting. And that's, I guess, where I want to go. You came across one book and then another, and you state you're not a scholar of Freud. You're not a scholar of psychoanalysis. If I recall correctly, you've not been in analysis.
Can't you tell?
No comment. One would say there's a measure of happenstance here, right? But that's not an explanation that Master Sigmund would place much emphasis on.
What do you mean, happenstance in what sense?
Well, you sort of, I saw this book, and then I saw another book, and then you began to assemble your Freud's closet, right? And then it became something. So I guess I'm interested to hear your own understanding of the genealogy of the book. Because it seems, as you portray it, you saw a book here. It's like, oh, that's interesting. And then another here. It's like, well, I have an earlier book here, so I'll get this one. And then it adds up.
So an archaeologist, I'm not the only one to talk about this. People have talked about the difference between archaeology, which was one of Freud's favored metaphors, right?
His objects.
The psyche is his objects. The psyche is a layered strata of historical events that somehow have become materialized. And people have pointed out that Freud himself was not an archaeologist, he was a collector. And there's a distinction between digging things up and collecting them. And what I wanted to write about was not digging things up. Derrida already talked about the kind of the violence of the Yerushalmi method of we know something about Freud that he was not willing to show or say. We will compel him to confess his Jewishness. This is actually what he tries to do in the last chapter of Freud's Moses. Instead, what would it look like to have a
I want to just interject in defense of my teacher. Isn't there something psychoanalytic about that to raise to the surface?
Absolutely. This is the psychoanalytic method.
Yeah.
So it's very clever. You use the psychoanalytic method to uncover pieces of Freud, fragments of Freud that if that's mine, I heartily apologize.
That's the clock tower.
Oh, well, I heartily apologize for the clock tower then. So the distinction of my method, which I hope also has some footing in the history of psychoanalysis. I try to find some way of grounding it in the history of psychoanalysis is influenced by surface theory, post-critique, and affect theory, and material objects. In other words, I do not put myself in any kind of power position over Freud. Instead of asking the question of how much Yiddish Freud knew, as scholar after scholar after scholar has done, including in Freud's own lifetime, my interest is in asking why we're asking that question, in understanding the question as a way to connect with Freud in certain ways, through scholarship, through collecting, and especially as Jewish languages are the node of connection. So the Jewish languages are things that connect me with Freud, and they connected Freud with Yehuda Dverdevosis, who he actually had contact with. They talked on the phone, which was complicated because Devosis didn't have a phone, so this was a complicated phone conversation. But these are Jewish connections that underlie scholarship, or maybe you could say are on the surface of scholarship. Why do you decide to write a book about Freud's Jewishness? There's something that appeals to you, and one of the things that I wanted to pay attention to was the appeal of Freud, and in particular the Jewish Freud. Freud is and was a fetishized object for Jews in his own day until today. And one of my chapters is about how Freud circulated in the interwar period in the Jewish press. There were over 50 dailies in Hebrew and Yiddish, and one of the things that they constantly had was who are the most famous Jews, like the most famous Jews contest. And Freud was always at the top of the list. Like, Jews were really into Freud without knowing very much about him. So what does it mean? Instead of like, oh, in order to write a book about Freud, I have to get myself psychoanalyzed. Maybe I'll actually become a psychoanalyst. I'll certainly read all of Freud. I'll certainly buy the standard edition and have it behind me for my author photo. No, what if instead of all that, I just talk about the level of connection that happens between people who barely know anything about each other?
A reception history?
In some ways it's a reception history, that's part of what it is. But it's a reception history that's a little bit more reflective than most, in the sense that I'm fully acknowledging that my whole interest in writing a book about Freud is because I wanted to own these books, and then eventually I had to figure out what to do with them, and it's me too. And I have all the Freud tchotchkes, and I would just add one more thing, which is that everybody knows that in order to write a book about Freud, you have to actually read all of Freud, and then you have to just, all the other things you have to do. It's a dauntingly vast field. And I'm like, to hell with the dauntingly vast. I got that. Who else has that? I have a niche.
Okay, I want to continue the further excavation of your method of excavating or surfacing.
Thank you.
Hide and seek.
Yes, hide and seek.
What's that? Describe your first two chapters and attempt at hide and seek.
So my first two chapters lay out how, really how easy it is, given the ideologies that are just part of the air we breathe, to posit that Freud's Jewishness, or his knowledge of Yiddish or his Hebrew, is the deepest part of his psyche. In other words, to trace the overlap between what's called the topographic model of the psyche. You see, I did learn something, and what I call the linguistic ideology of modern Jewish consciousness, which is that Jews somehow have some buried Jewish thing in them. This is also my chapter called Crypto Jews, which I talked about with Rachel over lunch. So the hidden Freud, the hidden Jew, Jews love that game, right? There's all these jokes about it. The Jew that erupts, right? The shortest joke I know with this form. Though tell me the book's already written, but if you know other jokes. So Mrs. Cowan's at the country club, and the waiter spills the soup on her, and what does she say? She says, "Oi Gewalt," whatever that means. So well, is nobody really laughing? I've told that joke very badly. But if you get it, is there someone that doesn't get that joke?
I understand the words, but I don't get it.
So in other words, she's hiding her Jewishness. I think the fact that I was able to write this book, and the fact that there's someone sitting here who didn't get the joke, means that ideology is on its way out. We now understand that, as I see it, the hidden Jew is an artifact of its loss as much as it is a feature of its stubborn persistence. What?
Because when one wants to hide oneself, the Zugnish or Gewalt.
She's shocked by the hot soup, so the unconscious Yiddish pops out of her because she's not on guard, and I think Cudahy tells this joke, and thus her true Jewish nature is revealed in the country club where she's been hiding her Jewishness.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you do get the joke. Okay, so everybody
Now
gets
that
it.
you've explained it.
I didn't get the country.
Yeah. So this is a joke type, and Freud himself reads the joke. And then what I say is, okay, enough with this. Let's stop playing this particular game, and let's see what happens if we accept Freud. What happens if we believe that Freud doesn't know Hebrew Yiddish, and if we accept that the Hebrew Yiddish he manages to pull out is in the service of telling the joke? It's not his deepest part, it's a kind of performance. Let's call it a collection. The same way he didn't dig up those little gods and idols, he also isn't allowing his deepest self to show up. It's a kind of production, a certain kind of cultural production of Yiddish, of his Jewishness, that's available even to acculturated Jews. And if you're not playing that's the deepest part of who he is, then what is that? And what do we do? And does anyone know the term bageling? Bageling is when you suspect that someone's Jewish. So first of all, there's this question of, are you Jewish or not, right? Do you play that game, right? Like you try to figure, and Freud describes this joke also in his book, Jokes. So is that person Jewish? So you kind of drop, in the book about, jokes, there's a Galicianer who's in a train car and he has his feet up on the opposite bench, and this proper-looking German gentleman walks in, and immediately the Galicianer puts his feet down, and the German says, "Can you tell me? Oh, excuse me. Do you happen to know when Yom Kippur is?" And the Galicianer says, "Why didn't you say so?" And he puts his feet back up on the chair. So that's called bageling, when you discreetly or not so discreetly, try to say, "I'm Jewish too." So this whole question of the Jewish studies academic trying to show just how Jewish Freud is, or Proust, or Kafka, or whatever, there's also Freud wanting to show us. That game is played in many different directions, in many different ways, and I wanted to talk about the game and not just play it. I also wanted to play it, but I also wanted to notice it was a game.
In the name of finding the real Freud?
No.
But
In the name of finding the real Freud, that is so weirdly foreign to how I've been thinking. It's like in the name of name of understanding.
Foreign to your way
yes,
of thinking.
very, very foreign to how I'm thinking. I'm interested in noticing the games that Jews play with each other in the names and in the name of trying to understand something about Jewish studies scholarship, in the name of reversing the Jewish studies gaze, of looking at Jewish studies scholarships and scholars like Yerushalmi and trying to figure out, why do they keep tormenting this poor dead guy? Why are they asserting what Lacan says about psychoanalysts, the people presume to know? I don't presume to know, and I actually think when Freud says one day science will begin to understand what Jewishness is, and people laugh at that like it's science fiction, I'm like, Good for you, Freud. Let's figure it out.
Okay,
Let's start figuring it out.
So what's your answer about why they are so persistent in this task, and what's the alternative model that you want to pose for not just the method in this book, but you've now sort of expanded the canvas. What's your project of Jewish studies?
So my project of Jewish studies is, mostly, I guess, looking at itself, looking at a certain kind of cultural capital, social capital that we almost instinctively own, and letting go of it a little bit, or holding it more lightly, or looking at it, and recognizing for instance, in this, I think what Freud said, that I feel that the deepest part of me is Jewish, and I don't know what it is, and I hope science will lay it out, and going, yeah, he's got something, instead of this gotcha game that we know what Jewishness is, but clearly Freud doesn't. Look, he doesn't even know Hebrew or Yiddish. In other words, a kind of respectful equivalence between, it's a little bit related to, I described two versions of Jew, not a Jew. You remember this part? So there was a Saturday Night Live skit called Jew, Not a Jew, where it was a game show where the Tom Hanks is Michael Landon, Jew, not a Jew, and someone's like, yes, Michael Landon, Jew, born Eugene Horowitz, like that game of discovering that someone is really Jewish who's trying to hide it. That game is totally obsolete. There's a new version on Hey Alma called Jew or Not a Jew. It's got almost the same name. Mm-hmm. Do you know Hey Alma, the feminist, Instagram, whatever? And there it's like Tony Shalhoub, Drake. Anytime there's a black person on the Hey Alma, Jew, Not a Jew, you know that they're Jewish. Because basically they're trying to get you to confess that you don't know who's Jewish or not, and that there are Jews of color, and that it's a totally different ball game. And there's something about the way this game is changing now, from Yerushalmi's day and Sandra Gilman and Boyar, that whole slew of people writing the Jewish Freud book, right? Let's find out that these things are actually Jewish. And we need to start doing that in Jewish studies. We need to, not that we need, who am I to say what we need? I wanted to write a book about taking a different approach to someone like Freud and talking about my own silly, uneducated love for these books, and figuring out what talking about that honestly has to say about the field as a whole. What happens when you ask scholars, why did you get into this? And instead of some brilliant idea, it turns out to be something like what I call this kind of Jewish connection in all its complications and all its aggressions and all its play, that still is so important to Jewishness, right? It's so important to, I quote you on this all the time, right? Like, did I hear you say, or do I hear someone quote you that you can't live in a less than 5 babka town? Right?
I can't.
So you can't live in so this idea of Jewishness as a form of connection, and we don't need another book about how Freud was mistreated because he was Jewish and people thought psychoanalysis. We need another book about why there's so many books like this, why Jewish scholars do this. And my feeling is that forget the argument, they just want to, actually say they want to touch Freud as a famous Jew, as a famous, fascinating Jew. They want to, and they want, of course, they want to assert their knowledge. They want to play Jewish games with Freud. I want to show the Jewish games that Jewish studies scholars play. Games Jewish studies scholars play.
We should open up because we have to wrap up in about 15 minutes, but so much more to talk about. The Jewish Freudian age of BLM, we should say a word about.
Well, oh my God! First of all, that seems so obsolete.
I have to say, I didn't read this book as a manifesto about the field of Jewish studies. Right? Are you ready to own it as that?
A manifesto in the most nonviolent, effective, post-critique way. In other words, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm going to write a crazy book. What?
You're telling us what not to do.
I'm not. Go ahead, write your Jewish studies book. I'm going to go ahead and be a little honest about my own investments in this subject. I'm going to talk about the pleasure of finding a niche. I'm going to talk about this is what my book is. I'm going to write an eccentric book that is going to resist playing a certain game, but also reflect on playing that game.
Right. Okay. So that's not quite a manifesto, but as you were talking, it sounded more manifesto-like. Do you want to say a word about about BLM or? So
that whole chapter, it seems. Everyone says, like, after October 7th, we're living in a totally different world. Mm-hmm. I wrote a chapter, it's right in the middle, it's called The Jewish Freud and Age of Black Lives Matter. It feels like it's a different universe, a different set of concerns. Maybe it isn't. And I've gotten a couple of reviews where people have said they've tried to extract, like, a kind of Zionist critique out of it, which you can do if, for the Hebrew chapter. But it's not foregrounded the way the race stuff is. So
yeah,
I feel like I don't even want to talk about it.
Okay. Anymore. All right. Let's open up for questions. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question. I guess I have a couple. I'll ask one to go with time. So you sound like you're saying this is like just a very Jewish thing, like continually, or at least like for a little while now, of like playing this game of wondering how Jewish people are. But I guess my question then is like, why are people so fixated on Freud specifically? Like, people aren't like having this. There's not this number of books about like Einstein being Jewish or like someone else, And then I guess like do you think that Freud's historical context specifically was like a time when it was especially possible to be like indeterminately sort of Jewish, or like was that possible hundreds of years ago, like 1,000 years ago, or like why is Freud like so much more subject to this?
So yeah, Freud is just it's such a great playing field to play this game, do not a do, right? Because you can get into so many layers but use his own method. That's one answer to the question. And yes, this is a time that, Jewish visibility was, I guess it still is a time that Jewish visibility is. But the question about Freud and Einstein is, thank you so much. I could have paid you to sit there because I actually addressed that question directly. My chapter about Freud and the Jewish press is called Psychoanalysis for Diabetics because the journalist Karl Kraus, who hated psychoanalysis, had said, psychoanalysis is the disease of Central European Jews. Eastern European Jews make do with diabetes. I'm like, well, yeah, but they also needed some Freud. So why did they need Freud, and what was the relationship between how much they needed Freud and how much they needed Einstein? They needed both Freud and Einstein. Freud and Einstein were the most famous Jews of their day, and this isn't just like me saying that. This is many lists of famous Jews. Lists of famous Jews this is like the beginning of the explosion of newspaper culture. And basically these people had to fill their newspapers, and they filled their newspapers. Among things they filled their newspapers with was famous Jews, arguments about famous Jews, lists of famous Jews. It's not that different from our own time, right? The Bar Mitzvah book, famous Jews. So with Einstein, and actually Freud and Einstein, the first time they met, someone said, you two, the two most famous Jews, you both happen to be in Berlin over the Christmas break for visiting your sons, you guys should meet. Freud wrote, I had a very nice afternoon with Einstein. He understood as much about psychoanalysis as I do about the theory of relativity, so it was a perfectly pleasant conversation. But the truth is there's no comparison between psychoanalysis and the theory of relativity, and I wouldn't have gotten a whole book about Einstein, Freudian, right? I mean, there's Einstein's very cute, his hair, the theory of relativity equals E equals MC2, and then you're done. Pretty much, unless you're really a sophisticated newspaper reader. With Freud, it's like, oh my God, sex and murder and scandal and Hollywood, what's his name, MGM, Louis Mayer? He got on a boat, like this was all over the New York Times, to go to Vienna to ask Freud to write a script for Hollywood for $100,000. about love, because he is the great and understands the power of love. Freud was, implicated in murder mysteries. I mean, it was never ending. There was so much. And it wasn't that they believed in psychoanalysis. The most major, for Freud's 80th birthday, so Freud was famous, and he was persecuted because he was Jewish, so that's another plus in his favor. Everyone talks about, that psychoanalysis had to overcome defenses because Freud was Jewish, but it worked the other way with his Jewish audiences. No one mentions that. We're like, okay, he's out of his mind, but he's Jewish and he's persecuted for it, so let's hear about it, right? So in the popular Jewish press in 1936 on his 80th birthday, long, major newspaper articles about the theories of Freud, and Ab Kahan, the editor of the Forward, wrote, this should not be taken as an endorsement of psychoanalysis. We've heard that psychoanalysis involves nervous women lying on their backs for 6 months and saying their thoughts to a doctor, and clearly these doctors are shocked. I'm like, 6 months, halavai, right? That's what they thought. They were, in other words, even if they were culturally conservative and they were certainly not recommending psychoanalysis, he filled pages, he sold papers. The Freud lullaby contest that the Forwards held in 1931. Freud was such a big part of Jewish culture. There were people making their living on the lecture circuit in interwar Poland as Freud experts, in Yiddish. And the audiences had to be taught not to laugh too hard. Right? In Central Europe, they had to be taught to overcome their instincts and their natural reserve to say their deepest, darkest sexual thoughts. In Eastern Europe, they had to be taught, this is serious, stop laughing. The moderator. So Freud served all kinds of cultural purposes. I mean, that's just scratching and Einstein certainly did too, no doubt.
Yeah, but it seems Einstein's the right comparator here.
Yes, and they knew it.
Both of them are canvases
yes.
upon which one's own vision of Jewishness and cultural identity were thrust. I think it's a really apt.
Absolutely.
Naomi and then Irene.
So I have a question and a suggestion, and you don't have to respond to both if one or both of them are for you, basically. My suggestion would be, and I'm just going to speak to the American Jewish context here, like the American Jewish Studies context, is that perhaps the need to Jewify Freud, to reclaim Freud as a Jew, is a response to the success of Jewish assimilation into American society. At first, you need to produce sameness in order to assimilate. But if you assimilate too much, then what's the difference between us and other white people? So then we switch into a mode of production of difference. And this is where someone like Freud, a weirdo, a Jewish weirdo, comes in, that we can reclaim these figures and reestablish the difference between us and sort of like the Wonder Bread majority. And then my question is about what you were saying about German. I was wondering if you could sort of complete a circle in my head. You mentioned that Yiddish, that there might be hostility towards Yiddish from German speakers because Yiddish sort of represents or embodies a certain amount of linguistic fusion that they've repressed. How would you then compare it to the hostility towards Yiddish from Hebrew and Hebrew speakers? Is it a similar reaction to the violation of the idea of linguistic purity that Hebrew speakers are very interested in cultivating? And then maybe does that tie back to how Freud felt about his work?
Wow, thank you. I think maybe I'll stick with the first one. I mean, the second one is like a book. But yeah, I think good hypothesis. In terms of the production of the use of Freud within a successful and acculturating society, that's really interesting. Mostly I looked at the use of Freud in Eastern Europe, in which Freud as the persecuted hero was so important. But just because I know you're interested in race, it might be of interest to you that Weinreich, who's Max Weinreich, Freud's Yiddish translator, spent a year at Yale studying personality, and with Edward Sapir and John Dollard, who's a race scientist. And during the winter break, he went down to the Tuskegee Institute, and he also seems to have read a lot of race science. Mm-hmm. And in his book that I've mentioned, Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, which it's still shocking to me that there's all these books about Freud and his Jewishness, and the fact that somebody's writing a psychoanalytically oriented book about Jewishness, who's friends with Freud, and who's in, nobody seems to know about that. But one of the things that Weinreich says that he got from American race science is he actually analyzes the obsession with famous Jews. And he says that he has this term, he likes the word compensation. He says that the obsession with famous Jews is a compensatory mechanism for the ego blow that is what he calls the attack of Yiddishkeit, by which he means finding out you're Jewish. And that's a narcissistic blow, which he says is unconscious in its earliest stages, which I believe him because I don't remember that then gets compensated for by Jewish narcissism, which he says Jews have a particular genius for. And then he says, but unfortunately, just when we really need Jewish narcissism, when we're surrounded by anti-Semites, the Jewish belief, all of Jewish religion, which is basically an elaborate compensatory mechanism to salve Jewish egos, he says just when we need it, we're left at a loss. But what comes in its stead is famous Jews. He basically believes that famous Jews are a sort of post-secular, post-traditional form of compensation for the Jewish ego. So, but that's about anti-Semitism. You're looking at a slightly, so I'm very interested in that, but I didn't answer your question. I'm just acknowledging that.
Okay, we have time for Irene's question.
What was a version of the second part of the
Oh, okay.
Which is to say, what about, and this is somebody with limited nuances of Yiddish, but what is the degree to which Yiddish would be legible to German speakers, and how does that accessibility play into your argument? I get, it's sort of the reversal version of the Yiddish making clear the quality of fusion languages, but what is the degree to which the quality of fusion languages enables German speakers to gain access to Yiddish, and how would that change?
Yeah. Well, that gets at the fact that Yiddish, the major, most striking, evident difference from German is the alphabet.
Right. But orally, maybe.
So orally, it sounds so similar. So basically, you're talking about putting something into almost a zone of opacity which is a zone of opacity for Freud too. So close, and yet it's like and I think it's very tempting to read that zone of opacity through fetish theory, right? But anyway, just some random thought.
Henry, the last question.
I'm very disturbed by the translation of unconscious to unbewusst. Unbewusst, to the best of my knowledge, is unknown. And unknown...
Yeah, that's exactly the problem that Weinreich had. So great minds think alike. The problem with translating unbewusst into unbewusst is that the Yiddish and German went their separate ways, and that bewusst in Yiddish means famous. Here we are, back to fame, right? So, and Weinreich's like, how is it that you think you're doing it, and he himself used it in his earlier exposition of Freud, how is it that you don't understand that Yiddish took a different path? And we have to, we're just borrowing, we're producing bad calques of Freud's German, and we're not plumbing the deep recesses of the language in order to discover the unique, what Yiddish has to contribute to psychoanalysis. He used the word Yetzer, for instance, for Trieb, or what the Standard Edition had as instinct, wrongly apparently, and which the Penguin translation has as drive, and he had as Yetzer. So there's this, and sometimes he went Hebraic. He looked for ways to find the distinctness of Yiddish in his translation.
But then my argument with Yevon is a false labeling of knowledge as Wissenschaft, which it is not. And I think we have problems here with language, with labeling, and now we're building a whole structure on pure fiction.
Or a more generous way of saying that is that we've introduced, through this apparent, direct, transparent translation of Wissenschaft into Wissenschaft, we've done something very tricky with the word Wissenschaft. We've, as Dipesh Chakrabarty would say, we've provincialized it. We've demonstrated that it means different things in different contexts.
Or, I suppose, an alternative more consistent with Henry's line, which is that it's a form of appropriation that brought with it all of the aspirations to integration and assimilation that quest for Wissenschaft meant in the German context, which was not an appropriate fit, I guess you're saying, at all in Yiddish-land. Right. Well, on that indeterminate note, I think we're going to have to bring to an end today's, the formal part of today's conversation. I just want to say that it is a measure of Naomi's really commendable intellectual suppleness that we had quite divergent ideas about what we two would be doing today up to like 3 minutes before we took the stage. And what has emerged...
And 3 minutes after.
And 3 minutes after. What has emerged amongst the show and tell, the presentation, and the conversation with us all that adds up to an incredibly stimulated effort.
Thank you.
So thanks so much,
Thank you.
Noah.
Thank you.